The Ryoan-ji Gardens in Kyoto, Japan are two gardens. You have the dry garden on the left, the wet garden on the right. And those are your two images for College Board. And these are part of a larger temple complex. So we're going to bust right into context here. And so part of a temple complex associated with Chinese Zen Buddhism. Zen means meditation. So these gardens and nature in general is the tool by which you then can meditate, get to a spiritual place, and perhaps even spontaneously and suddenly reach enlightenment. That's what really I think the purpose is of both gardens, but especially the dry garden. So as you look, as you contemplate, as you kind of focus in on the different natural shapes and the scene in general that you are looking at, you can achieve enlightenment through kind of that focus. Now, you don't think of anything else, you're focusing on the moment and the scene in front of you. So that's really what the purpose is of this entire piece. So, you enter through some gates and you kind of walk around the gardens. There's the abbot or the monks, the main kind of leader in the monastery, his home, and the dry garden is right in front of his residence. And I'll show you that in just a minute. Um, and then the wet gardens are in another area on the site. I would say also know, besides Zen Buddhism, which is more based in China, that the gardens are also inspired by the Shinto faith from Japan, where you focus on worshiping the deities through nature and in nature. So, using nature as a very spiritual means reminds me a lot when we talked about the Etruscans, who would do that also. So that's kind of your context. Again, temple complex, monastery grounds here for monks. You have Zen Buddhism, Shinto faith religion from Japan being influenced here. And you're achieving enlightenment through meditation, through introspection, and through the use of nature to kind of guide you to that moment of enlightenment. So the dry garden. So the top picture is an image of the dry garden. The middle picture of the interior space, that's inside the abbot's residence, which is right beside the dry garden. And then the bottommost image is a close-up of a nature or landscape like within the abbot space. And we'll talk about all of those. Again, the garden is meant to encourage contemplation, and everything here is somewhat symbolic. So the smaller white gravel would be a symbol of moving elements: water, the sea, the air, waterfalls. And it's raked every day in very particular patterns, lots of spirals, lots of waving lines. So that helps convey that sense of motion and movement. The rocks there and the moss around them suggest islands or bridges, shorelines, and there are 15 of those rocks in different sizes in 5 different groupings. So 5 of those little mossy islands, little sections, but 15 rocks in total. And then ultimately there is a clay wall around the garden. And that wall is aged, and the color has faded, it has worn. And one of my favorite terms of all time, vocabulary wise in art history, but just in general life kind of term, is this term called wabi sabi, where you see the beauty in what is worn and aged. You embrace the change and you embrace the imperfections that come. And it is beautiful, and it is instructive, and it is just natural. So that wall is very much kind of that reminder of wabi sabi. And also, it is it is in a way, if you look down at the painting on the bottom and then look back up at the dry garden, the color palette is similar. A very organic kind of simplistic color scheme, monochromatic. And then the atmospheric perspective, like the kind of hazy, washed out color is reminiscent of like the clay wall being that sense of atmospheric perspective, and then the rocks in the dry garden being like the mountains. So the paintings inside the abbot's residence kind of tie in very nicely to the dry garden outside. We think the original garden had 9 stones, and it was symbolic of like a mother tiger with her 9 cubs. But now it's 15. And what's kind of cool is you could only see from any point along the viewing area, you could only see 14 stones at one time. The symbolism there is that the 15th stone would only be viewable when you achieve enlightenment. So you're always seeing an incomplete view. And it's this process that continues until that moment where you reach enlightenment. So it's just this, every view is different, but it is always incomplete. And again, that enlightenment, when it's achieved, you would see that 15th stone. Now, the wet garden in another area of the temple complex kind of looks like set up to be like the gardens of medieval era Japan. The look of it is very organic, clearly, but everything has been strategically placed to suggest that naturalism. So this isn't an unmanicured, kind of just left to nature garden. It's very strategically created, but at the same time looks very natural. It's not overly manicured, let's say like a French garden from Versailles, which was definitely highly manicured and looked it. And not in Versailles, the garden was meant to showcase the power of the ruler and power over nature. This is absolutely not that. Yes, we're changing nature and manicuring it, but it's meant to look organic and natural so that it will inspire you in your path of enlightenment. So very different. There's a tea house near this wet garden, and what I put down at the bottom, it's not a College Board image, but I just wanted you to see it. There's this basin of water by the tea house with the fountain, which is what you're seeing, that you have to bend down to use. If you go in a water fountain on campus, you don't have to bend down too much. This you really do. And it's meant to show your being in a state of humility, humble, reverence to nature. You are not above everything. You are, that humble one with nature, or even nature. You kind of show your reverence for it in your interaction with nature to lead you to your enlightenment, getting out of that cycle of samsara, getting out of this cycle of suffering. And I think that in part is very symbolic of you releasing your ego and then getting further down that path. Water also with the wet garden is a symbol of purification, often used in rituals, and so that you can tie in as well. So the Ryoan-ji gardens, in terms of function, very spiritual, and then also ritualistic because the monks are raking the dry garden every day. I would say ritual as well. And then for formal qualities, line and pattern. Line and pattern with the dry gardens, with the lines, those curving lines that are raked into the sand or the gravel, that white gravel, suggesting movement. Also spacing Spacing definitely, because you can't see everything at once. And that's, meant to be symbolic of that continued journey. And ultimately, if you saw all 15 rocks, it would be enlightenment. I think that would be appropriate as well. So again, I highly recommend Friendship Garden in Balboa Park. If you go in there, there is a dry garden at the kind of the base of the garden, and it's very much like this. It reminds me a lot of it, so I highly recommend checking that out if you get the opportunity. It's an art piece. This is an art piece. You can kind of get a very similar experience locally. So again, that's the Ryoan-ji Gardens from Kyoto, Japan.